Thanks. Thanks you all for joining tonight. I know our lives are all busy. I approach my profession in a very unique way. I began as a therapist many, many years ago. I got my license in California in 1994 and actually didn't enjoy testing at the time. But then I migrated over to the testing side of the profession and fell in love with it. And really, what drove me much more into what I'm doing now was I felt like therapy really wasn't grabbing on to my clients' needs the way I wanted to. And I'm a therapist that really works at having a product at the end of my time with my clients. And really, so what drove me to this was trying to conceptualize for my clients a better way to get their issues resolved. And uniquely enough, or serendipitously enough, it became much more about an ADHD profile that I was seeing with a lot of my clients. And with that came the desire to make a bigger impact. So what I found was by assessing and then by supporting a student in school, I could have a much broader impact on the continuum of their life, rather than just helping them symptomology within a therapy setting. So by setting up assessments and creating 504 plans and supporting IEPs and doing work-related accommodations, I found that I was actually improving the success of my clients, which in turn really met my need. So I went from a therapist to educational psychologist, and then recently I harnessed the licensed educational, or rather licensed professional clinical counselor. So I hold a lot of credentials within California. And ironically, I grew up with ADHD, and my professor in school always said, "You'll never make it," which, if you know ADHD, we take that as a challenge. And so I proved him wrong. And when I rub shoulders with my colleagues, they're all, I say this very humbly, very impressed that I have so many credentials. And it's ironic that me, the ADHD kid in school who barely finished high school, has become a real purveyor of support for my clients. And now I'm doing assessments primarily remotely all across California. So when Learnfully and I connected about 5 years ago, I sort of supported them in developing some of their components. And then most recently, Kevin and I reconnected and we thought about doing some more work together. So here I am.
And we're pleased to.
But as we start out with the first slide, the day in the life of an ADDer. Um, Constantly losing things on his desktop. Uh, I, struggling with organization and neatness. This is intriguing because ADHDers, we tend to organize by visual rather than by file. And so typically a common idiosyncrasy of ADHDers is that we organize by stacks. So if you were to ask your partner, go and get this document for me, it's always in a stack rather than in a file. Now, the stack works well for us because the concept is out of sight, out of mind. And so we tend to hate to put things out of sight because we'll forget what we're doing, but only we understand the nature of the stack. Um, Problem staying on top of bills, appointments, and other responsibilities. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Attitude magazine, but there was a wonderful article there on the tax of ADHD. And what they were referring to was the intrinsic penalties and late fees and readjustment fees that we make on across of our billing processes. And even though we've paid on April 15th our taxes for how many years, somehow we're still never ready to pay taxes on the 15th of April. It's not uncommon you feel overwhelmed or frustrated with everyday tasks, even though you've done them frequently. We have that skill of hyperfocus and disorganized. A strong emotional reaction to seemingly to very minor things, which links later on to what we're going to be talking about, and that's the emotional reactivity or dysregulation. Things that we don't recognize, things that build up inside of us as we're moving forward, but it's that the straw that breaks the camel's back, which is typically what takes place with ADHDers. Something that is really a non-issue becomes an issue. It's until we unravel the event that we're able to recognize that the event really wasn't the thing that triggered our reaction, but it was the buildup of all the prior reactions that we failed to really process and metabolize. So going to move to the next one. So as we get into the concept of ADHD, there are some four primary components as a clinician that we have to establish before we move forward. And that first one is this, the several inattentive or hyperactivity impulsive symptoms prior to the age of 12. And we'll get into how we harvest that information later on in the presentation. Very key feature because unless you have a presentation before the age of 12, it's really hard to fit through the eye of a needle your explanation on what's going on. Now, there are explanations that explain why ADHD types of symptoms occur after the age of 12, but it really needs to have that watermark of prior to the age of 12. And there needs to be several symptoms that are currently impacting you across your domains of home, work, life, interactions with your relationships, recreational life. There has to be some quantifiable features that are constantly plaguing you. So it's a pervasive condition rather than episodic condition. And we have to demonstrate that the symptoms interfere or reduce the quality of life across social, academic, and even your occupational functioning levels. And then lastly, we need to rule out that it's not being triggered by other emotional or mental conditions. And so we have to make sure that all four of these grounding anchors we can address and explain before we move into the diagnosis of ADHD. So what's intriguing is the A in the ADHD is very clear. And this typically stands out with most folks when they come into our office and when they're reading or if they're interacting with someone and they're being very transparent. They oftentimes feel they don't give enough attention to the details. The old phrase, devil in the details, is really true for all of us who have ADD. Um, we often have difficulty sustaining attention during tasks or even our recreational time. We get bored quickly. Often doesn't seem to be listening. It's like when you drive and you've driven for a half hour and you're really wondering what items you passed because you don't have any recollection of all of the typical road signs you would normally see, and you sort of wonder, how did I get here? That's somewhat of an event that takes place while we're conversing with people. We can have two or three conversations going on and multiple screens, but unfortunately, we're not able to process all that auditorily. Um, and we oftentimes don't follow through on the instructions. You've seen those memes on Facebook where they say, pick up the paper and you'll see scissors, and immediately the person will start cutting the circle off the paper. But then the directions are, don't cut anything yet. Wait till you finish listening to all the instructions. Very typical for us ADHDers. Oftentimes difficulty organizing tasks and gathering all the parts that we need to complete a task. Um, Things that require engagement and sustained attention, we will typically procrastinate. And then one asks, why do you procrastinate? And we sort of have this deer in the headlights look in our eyes. And that's primarily because it's like fingers on a chalkboard. When we know we have to execute lengthy, somewhat motoric, laborious tasks, we tend to avoid those. Lose things or not completing the tasks or activities in order to make progress forward. Um, Distracted by extraneous variables. I do a lot of assessments for candidates to take the bar exam, and I'm constantly requesting private rooms, even headphones, anything that will help cut out those distractions that typically will cause us to not complete what we need to do. And ironically, those distractions do feed the beast because our neurology is trying to boost its neurochemicals. And when we get distracted, it allows us to somewhat take a breather with our brain, but it only creates more of a chaotic feature when we're trying to accomplish something. So let's move on. The or rather the H hyphen I in ADHD is we often fidget or taps our feet. It's somewhat the sewing machine leg, where you see the leg constantly moving like an old sewing machine when they didn't have motorized uh, machines. Um, More so for boys than girls, but often runs and climbs in situations where it's inappropriate. Um, I'm sure that those of you that already know you have ADHD, I'm sure you heard your parents, your mother, your guardian would say you would never stop until your head would hit the pillow. Um, Talks excessively. You see the meme that I have here. It's Tigger, and it was a perfect meme to encapsulate this H factor in the ADHD profile. Uh, is and the talking excessively is really intriguing because it's not that we want to be rude, but it's that we have a surge of insight or inspiration. And because we know in our metacognition that we have a hard time remembering what we want to say. It's like we just want to say it all at one time to get our thoughts out. Oftentimes, ADHD people, they don't think clearly unless they hear themselves talk. So when you hear people talking out loud, oftentimes the idea is, wow, what an idea I had. I never thought about it until I heard myself say it. Now, when you work with other folks that are more internal, my wife, for example, she can say the same thing I say in a matter of 5 sentences, where it takes me 15 minutes to say the same idea. And it's because I want to elaborate all the nuances. It's like I have a hyperlinks on all of what I'm trying to explain. And so I want to pursue all the hyperlinks within my process of thinking. Oftentimes, it's hard to relax and engage in leisure activities. Uh, when we're on vacation, our spouses or our significant others or our kids will say, "Dad, why don't you join us?" And it's like, "Well, I'm here," but the realities are is that we're sort of here, but sort of not. We have multiple things going on all the time. We blurt out answers before a question's completed. Interesting that that happens to us, and I'd like to look beyond the curtain of the drama or the symptomology. And again, it goes back to just that impulsiveness, but it's not because we want to be rude. It's much more about our desire not to forget what we want to say, or we're so excited about what we want to say. We're almost like a youngster at Christmas time. We can't help but open the package quickly. And oftentimes there's a lot of history around getting wrong answers. So when we finally feel like we have the right answer, it really drives us to make sure that we're in front of the line by providing finally the correct answer, but then we get it wrong because we said it at the wrong time, or socially we got somewhat sneered at because we interrupted the person talking. And so then we sort of have to recoup our emotionality and recognize that the answer was right, but still yet the timing was wrong. And so difficulty waiting one's turn, um, and often interrupts or intrudes on others. Because of this sense of imperativeness that ADHD people have, we don't always watch for social cues. We don't look for the proximity of a conversation. And so instead of pausing and slowing down and recognizing that people are standing close because they want to have more of a confidential conversation, we'll just step right into their space and start listening or talking. And then we'll get those unique kind of looks like, are you clueless? Which unfortunately, ADHD people tend to be a little clueless with our social interactions. So you can see how this H factor we have a lot of good intentions, but the best of intentions tend to foul up our overall progress. Now, the next one is obviously there's no C in ADHD, but there is the combined type. And that's where we have, at least we have to have 5 symptoms of the inattentive type and 5 symptoms of the hyperactivity impulsivity type. And so I won't go through all of those because we've just covered each one of those individually. But again, A combination, 5 of each of those within the last 6 months is the quantifier for the ADHD combined presentation. Now, the final two pieces are significant when I'm working as a clinician and having to uh, decide on the diagnosis. And that's where I need to determine the level of severity. And there's mild, moderate, and severe. And that's all contingent upon the level of impairment that the individual is having with their symptomology. And the next is the potential of a differential diagnosis. And you can see we have a zebra colored elephant and the little uh, uh, rubber ducky that's different colored. There definitely can be commingling of ADHD with other features. But again, we go back to which was the driving force before the age of 12. Now, oftentimes people that are undiagnosed will will manifest anxiety and depression, sleeplessness, irritable bowel syndrome, all as a byproduct of undiagnosed ADHD. And so I just spoke with a mother this morning because I'm going to be testing her daughter. And the same thing she was reporting is that she'll lay at bed at night before she realized that she had ADD, and she would worry, and she thought her issues were relative to the issue of anxiety. And so she was being treated for anxiety. But then after she realized it, it was really an undiagnosed ADHD profile. People with ADHD, they have a hard time turning off their minds. And so when we don't have the distractions of everyday life drama, what tends to happen is that our brains are now settled into a sleep mode. And then what do we do is the ADHD brain is somewhat carnivorous. We always have to be moving. So if we can't move our bodies, we move our minds. And so we worry about what we forgot to do today or those blunders that we had when we interrupted someone or we spoke out of turn in a staff meeting. And so we rehearse those while we're sleeping. Or we think about all the other things we forgot many years later. I recall even having dreams years afterwards that I was late handing in a paper in sixth grade or a paper in high school or missing a date in college. And so the ADHD brain is wonderful in some ways, but very unforgiving in others. And so people tend to stay awake at night worrying about what they forgot or even worrying about what they know they're going to forget the next day. So it really becomes an intriguing issue where we're really having to help sort through differential diagnoses. And again, the real threshold is what we talked about earlier, and that's the issue of did these items begin before the age of 12? And we're going to get into how we determine that in just a few more minutes. The interesting thing is about ADHD, and I hear a lot of people talking about it, is it does become a bit of a superpower. If you can get beyond the hurdles and uh, the maze of growing up, and I'm very fortunate that I was able to maneuver through that, it's really become a power source for me. Um, as you can see here, creativity and innovation, laser focus, problem solving. Um, I heard a speaker the other day say that 300% of those who are entrepreneurials have ADHD. And that's because we don't give up. We're relentless. We have tenacity. And that's because we've struggled so much in life that we realize that if we allowed those struggles to captivate us and to define who we are, we would never get anywhere. So one of the flip sides of ADD is this ability to have a lot of grit and to have a lot of guts and to try new things out. We're very spontaneous, very adventuresome. And you can see, because we're always looking for novelty, if you can use your desire for the twinkling lights and the sparkly things, but you realize once they die down and that luster leaves, then you still have to stay on track. And again, if you know folks or if you have ADHD, we have multiple hobbies or things going on at one time. I've got 2 or 3 projects, maybe even 4 or 5 if you ask my wife, in the garage waiting for other parts that I'm harvesting off of the internet or off of Facebook or other items that I'm constantly harvesting into my scrapbook of projects. And people say, how do you keep track of it? And it's sort of like, well, it's like my toy box. It's like I'm constantly putting parts together and finding things that normally wouldn't go together mechanically that I'm now making something out of it. So very much of a MacGyver kind of ability. Boundless energy, enthusiasm, optimistic. We have a very strong sense of fairness, which probably originates out of the amount of unfair behavior that we perceive that we've experienced. That brings me to an interesting space. I spoke to someone today, and the turning point for a lot of people with ADHD is that we always believe that people put a sign on our back that says, kick me. And that's the early phase of ADHD, is that we believe that everyone's out to kick us. But when we recognize what's going on with our ADHD, we can step back and say, you know what? I've been putting that sign on my back myself. And so we have to take an event and re-engineer the event to figure out 5 or 6 steps before what we thought was an insult to us. We missed road markers and signs that we should have been observant of that our ADD blinded us to. And now we can approach situations with a better cognition. And that's why I oftentimes use when I coach and I do therapy, it's let's re-engineer a position or a situation because we've lived through it before. It shouldn't take us by surprise. It's like a traffic engineer professional. They know exactly where the intersections have the most accidents. So they know where to put the stop signs or the stoplights or the blinking lights. For ADHD, it's the same way. We have to slow down enough in order to predict where our next failure is going to be so that we can re-engineer our approach to that intersection. So wide angle thinking ability. I was going to use broad-minded, but I hate that term because it sounds like somehow I'll accept cats running like dogs or dogs meowing like cats. This is much more of a wide angle thinking ability where nothing is out of the possibility or the realm of possibility. So that's what gives us that sense of creative innovative ingenuity. Now, what happens are people are asking me to join them at their table because I'm able to pull together seemingly unconnected parts into a plan of attack, into a problem solving mode. So it really truly has become a super strength for myself. And when I talk to other folks, that term is becoming much more readily descriptive of folks with ADHD because they have passed through many of the hurdles that once held them back. So let me watch my time here, 5:53. I want to go through a few more pieces here. What to look for in ADHD assessment. For those of you that are looking for an assessment, you want to keep these 6 things in mind when you talk to a professional. You want to find out how they gather the information, how they're going to separate the differential diagnoses, how they're going to harvest the symptomology identification, and how they're going to develop the functional impact. And then what standardized tests are they going to use to quantify what they're seeing? And then how are they going to blend that into an accommodation and support plan? The first piece that I've used, and I love this product, it's the Diva, and it was developed in England. We don't have anything like it here in the United States. And so I use this all the time. They have an adult version, which you see on the screen. They have a child and youth version. And it's a very structured methodology that goes through all 9 of the characteristics of ADHD, the inattentive type, and the hyperactivity type. And not only do they ask you specific questions, but they give you prompts that are relative to that particular symptom within the domain of childhood and youth, as well as the domain of adulthood. And then it goes into all of the different areas of impact. So once you complete this and your clinician is using it, they have a rich resource to fill in all the blanks that are being required of a thorough diagnosis. The next comes from the land down under. This was developed in Australia, ran across it. I hate doing paper pencil types of tasks when I know that someone smarter than me has created something far better than what I'm used to. And I've gotten used to the algorithms and the computer technology. And this program, I'm able to send to a client a link. They open it up and it asks them all the sorts of questions that I need to know about in order to help differentiate what's going on in their world. And so it's a wonderful tool. I encourage you to ask for these tools specifically if you're using a clinician. And when you're looking for a clinician, which is one of the questions that was posed prior to the workshop, you want to find a clinician that allows you to do some window shopping, is the phrase that I use. You want someone that's willing to take time and answer your questions and let you kick the tires and smell the leather in the new car. You want someone that is passionate about what they're doing on your behalf so that they will be using the right tools, and don't hesitate to ask them. What tools do you use to differentiate a diagnosis? What tools do you use to harvest the history of my world so that you can accurately represent what I'm doing? I'm very much of a consumer advocate, and make sure you ask the right questions. Um, the symptom identification. Here are four. I use a variety of them depending on the presentation of my client. But the SWAN, it's a question that's been out for a long time. The Weiss, functional impairment rating scale. The Vanderbilt, which I've heard many people refer to. A lot of pediatricians will use this. And the Wander, which is the Winder, which is from the University of Utah and one of its professors. All three great symptom identification tools. The next is the standardized testing. Many tests are out there, and these tests specifically, the first four, are to harvest the behavioral components of ADHD so that we can quantify what's going on, not only with the ADHD, but the other supporting mechanisms, which we all heard a lot about, and that's the executive functioning features. So the first four not only help you identify the dynamics of ADHD, and it quantifies it within the domain that clinician needs to be using. So that's why I really encourage a clinician to use these. I have a lot of school psychology friends and educational psychology friends. Many of them use them. Now, I tend to overuse them because I like to make sure that I'm not singularly using one of these arrows with the pointed tip. I want to make sure that they're all targeting the same features. So I'll actually give the Connors, the Browns, and the brief. Now, I know that the folks at Learnfully, which years ago when we started working together, I really enjoyed the SIFI, which is the Comprehensive Executive Function Inventory, a very good tool. I have moved away from the SIFI only because of my own personal preferences, but I still like it. The next is the MOXO, which is a in real time measurement that's based off of a video game format, but it measures your receptivity and your reactionary components of your neurology. It's a game feature that introduces a visual stimulus, and you play the game, and it gives you visual stimulus that is intended to distract you. And then it introduces auditory stimulus, which again is intended to distract you. And then they enter in both of those, visual and auditory stimulus. And again, they're measuring your reaction time to see which one of those stimulus or which combination of stimuluses has the most impact on your ability to stay focused. Very interesting process. So these are five standardized tools that I would encourage anyone to use, or to make sure that whoever's testing you are using. The last would be the recommended accommodations. There's a variety out there, but as you can see, your assessment needs to merge into a very articulated accommodation package. I just finished a accommodation package for a bar student out of New York State, and it was very intriguing because the manner that the bar exam requested was very confusing in regards to the candidate needing to know what they needed to know and represent. So I took that, and it's somewhat of an example of innovation. I took their bar exam candidate handbook and I put it in a table of contents. And I created a table that allowed me to represent their needs, but then I supported the evaluator so that they would know exactly where in my report they could find the answers to what their rubric is requiring that they find in the document that I was presenting. Ironically, the reviewer didn't really review my document. The client got rejected for their accommodations, and we had to rewrite the report, not my report, but the presentation on how the reviewer failed to really examine the document with the veracity that it needed to. And ironically, the table they didn't use, and when I resubmitted my appeal, I re-emphasized that the table that I provided for them actually still continued to answer all the questions that were required for that particular bar exam. A very interesting challenge. And so every time I do accommodations, I always like to hear reports back from my clients because there's always a challenge. Even though accommodations are valuable, people are still a bit of an old school thinking. And sometimes I wonder, am I doing a justice to someone who needs an accommodation? And the realities are, it came to mind that mechanics are constantly tweaking their tools in their toolbox. And so they need to accommodate to reach a particular nut or bolt that the new auto manufacturers created. And there might not be a tool for that. So what did they do? They made an accommodation to a tool that already exists so that they can actuate that particular need they have. So again, bravo for accommodations. And I always like to make sure my work is really applicable to applying to support my client's best interest. So, Kevin, I think we're at about quarter till, and we might have time for questions.
That's impressive. Since you are ADD, you got done right on time. All
So,
right. Thank you. That was amazing. Let me share my presentation now. So before we go into the Q&A, if you want to get in touch with us, contact@learnfully.com. You can call or text or schedule a call back. We can connect you with Dr. Betancourt if you need some more thorough evaluations. And what I would like to do is if you have questions, you can use the icon at the bottom of the screen, which is a hand icon, just like that, to raise your hand. We're going to go through the questions that were submitted in advance first, and then we'll go to the open questions from there. So, Dr. Betancourt, how do you find a reputable local testing professional? So someone, what would you look for uh, in order to determine like, oh yeah, this person is legit?
good question. The best meaning people have the best meaning ADHD features. Mental health folks typically are horrible at returning phone calls. And so I would encourage you to not be discouraged if you have someone you like and they're not returning their phone call. That's probably an ADD component that they need to work on. So don't judge them harshly, but you really need to find someone that's willing to let you window shop, willing to respond to your questions, not to make you feel silly for answering the questions. But if they need to spend a half hour on phone time explaining what they do and how they do it, that's a valuable component in looking for someone. Or you want someone that can also request your students' records. Commonplace for me is before I move forward with accepting a client, I want to see their records. Even if it takes me a half hour to review their records offline, I will oftentimes look at those and help me sort through really what's the assessment going to facilitate. They're going to spend good money on a good assessment, but we want to know the purpose and where that assessment's going to be targeted to support that.
Terrific. How about credentials? Like you were telling me, um, licensed social workers, licensed educational therapists. Like there are a variety of different acronyms of people that are doing the testing. Are there any common denominators that you look for, like organizations are part of, or that sort
Yeah,
of thing?
I work for one organization, and I think they might overspend the term ADHD assessment. I think a good clinician can always diagnose someone with a feature because that's within our wheelhouse of expertise. Diagnosing and assessing are two different terms, and I want to make sure you as a consumer recognize that. Be diagnosed allows them to move forward with a treatment plan. To have an assessment really means much more of a clinical evaluation outlining the tools that I presented to you that are very specific to come up with a plan that can be reputably presented to a school, to a college, to a place of work. And all of those require the qualitative and quantitative standardized measures. So you want to make sure that what you're doing is not just getting a diagnosis, but if that's what you need, that's fine. And everyone that Kevin just mentioned, all of those acronyms would work for you. But you really do need to push through that initial shopping spree and find out how do they assess and differentiate between diagnosing and assessing.
Great. Do ADHD, oh, this is a great one. Do ADD, ADHD signs or symptoms appear differently in males versus females?
Yes, they do. And in fact, before I forget, I wrote all of my responses out in more detail, and I'll forward those to you, Kevin, so that after the fact, I've gone into more quantitative answer on all of these. So I'll get those over to you before the end of the evening, and then you can pass those out as technology allows. But yeah, one of the biggest features is that girls tend to be underdiagnosed simply because of their growing up style of function. Girls aren't, it's not acceptable for girls to be runabouts and climbers and interrupters. Girls have much more of a polite mannerism, which does tend to cause them to be underdiagnosed. It's not that they don't have all that energy. It's just that energy isn't as acceptable if you're a female versus a male. So males get much more diagnosed with that. And it's much more reasonable for males to be involved in sports, which we can burn off a lot of our hyperactivity energy. So yeah, there's definitely a different approach to the diagnosing process as well as the assessment process. Um, and it's more common for females to demonstrate the traits of ADD, not so much the H factor, but the inattentive factor once they get into high school. That tends to be where the seams start to rip out a bit because they've held it together really well and courteously throughout their life, and now it's becoming more unmanageable. And then
No,
there's some
yeah,
they're thinking some brain research is supporting that the chemistry is a little different with the hormonal shifts between males and females does impact the way our neurobiology operates.
interesting. So it's neurobiological, and there's also a cultural component to it.
Yes.
Um, as children develop into adulthood, would ADD, ADHD become more acute
It's
as
a
they
good
get older?
question. Yeah, good question. Typically, if you have, I would say, a mild to very insignificant ADHD profile, I would say that you're lucky enough to have the benefits of ADD without the sort of the dysfunctional side of ADD. So for those particular small population, you actually move into adulthood with less drama and you maintain your productivity. ADHD is a lifelong characteristic, and if it's undiagnosed, it will only develop into a snowball effect as you get older because we tend to harvest and attract different lifestyles and habitual operational patterns that don't function well when we move into adulthood. The due dates, the requirements, a lot of these features that we were able to get away with when we were in grade school and high school, they start costing us a lot of money as we get older. And so it does snowball as we get older. I wish I could say it gets better. But the realities are is that if it goes untreated, and I would say most folks, I would say about 20% of the population goes undiagnosed or untreated. And I meet so many, even of my old friends who were wonderful people, but now they're in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and they never found their anchor in life. And they're incredibly brilliant, but they never found the handles to get them to the location where they could be. And now they have a lot of regrets. And unfortunately, a lot of times that lifestyle does breed multiple significant relationship changes, job changes, poor income results. So it's not a pretty sight. And that's what sort of drives me to help diagnose folks and assess folks more is because if I can get them on the right pathway, more so than therapy, but if I can get them in the right pathway, then things unfold because I believe my clients are much smarter than we give them credit for. So if you give them the right tools, they matriculate to a better place naturally.
Great. The second part of this question is can environmental factors influence ADD, ADHD? And the one I'm thinking of that sort of leaps out is screens and screen use. But I don't know if that's what the questioner had in mind. But can you speak to that just briefly?
Yes. In fact, they're finding a lot of folks now that smoking isn't such a big deal in our culture, the impact of smoking has actually does produce measurable results with the increase of ADHD. Obviously, other toxicity issues play a role into a variety of, in utero effects. But the realities are is that folks, ADHD is 80% inheritable. So when I talk to folks, I'll ask them specifically about their parents or their other siblings or their aunts or uncles. And it'll be interesting that they oftentimes will say yes. And then what happens is typically if I'm working with a child that has ADHD, one of their parents does. And so then I backtrack and say, how's your home life managed and structured? And oftentimes it's that ADHD parent that tends to drive the subculture in the house. And so what I need to do is if I'm dealing with the student's ADHD, then I need to help support the family's management structure so it doesn't breed more ADHD chaos. So what happens is we've got a child that has a propensity genetically for ADHD or other issues that are going on in utero, and now they come to my office when they're age 10. But if I don't remediate the environment, it tends to only exacerbate the overall profile, which then it starts feeding the beast that they're trying to cure and change.
Interesting. But yeah, I definitely see that as well in my own family. Uh, as far as this is another good one. None of these are softballs, by the way. What alternatives are available if the child is adamant about not going on medication? And then there's a reference to a New York Times article about always take medication or only take it when needed. So, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I'll include my response because it's really a valuable question. Um, and there's a lot of homeopathic ideas out there that work well. Um, we've tried them for, I've got out of three of my sons, two of them inherited ADHD. And my wife does not have ADHD. And so that's an intriguing confirmation of the phenomenon. But the realities are is that um, that particular article that was referenced, it was in the New York Times, and I referenced it and I did some research on it. I didn't read the article, but I was a little jaundiced on the presentation of the article, and there was a review of the article, and it really had some old school thinking about medication. Not that medication is the end all be all, but there's so much support now about the neurochemistry and the lack of
Yeah,
neurotransmitting components, the serotonin, our dopamine, our other neurochemicals that in the ADHD brain, they have in fact found evidence that we don't develop those or create those as automatically as the non-neurotypical individual. So we really are set up. It's sort of like asking, it's like putting shades on someone that's blind. We can put shades on someone that's blind, shades, but it's not going to change their blindness. Or we can put shades on someone who's colorblind, and it's really not going to change the way they see the lights when they come to a stoplight. So I'm not a proponent of medication. What I always tell parents is let's engineer the environment first. For example, what I had to do for our son, my wife and I, for our youngest, who's now 25, and he's going to become a psychologist, ironically, we went to the dollar store and bought 5 different baskets. And on Sunday night, we would separate all of his clothes in a basket, underwear, pants, socks, shirts, shoes, everything, so that we engineered his daily function in a better way so he wasn't chaotic in the morning getting ready for school. The night before school, we would engineer his backpack so that he could leave school without stress. We would make sure that he would have good night's sleep. We would make sure he would have good, not so much health-minded food, but a good, well-balanced food for his neurobiology. So there's a lot of things we can do to support healthy living that's just good, healthy living. That works strongly for the ADHD profile. Ultimately, I tell parents, if you don't see the change, then I will also include in my send to you, Kevin. It's called ADHD over the lifespan, and it's some very highly regarded psychiatrists that help explain the pros and cons of medication and how ADHD doesn't get healed over time, but we have to mitigate it because it's like a chronic kidney disease or liver disease that unless we take care of it, it's not going to self-improve. So,
Gotcha. Okay. So if you had to come down on one side or the other, always take it or only take it when needed?
um, my belief is you take it 24/7. And I can go into detail as to why. And probably the first, the,
No, that's okay.
great.
You don't have to go into detail. It's just, are you saying like you get on ADHD medication and then just follow it, or only get on it when you need to get on it?
Good question. If you choose to go medication, don't stop it on weekends or don't stop it on holidays or don't stop it during the summertime. What we have to do is we have to engineer the way an ADHD person thinks and responds so those
Yes.
become habitual, which that's the value of maintaining it on all the time rather than episodically.
Perfect. Okay. Uh, are there specific assessments educators can use within the classroom setting? So we have a group, like our group here tonight is we have associated professionals, we have school administrators and teachers, we have tutors and executive function coaches and parents. So we're getting lots of different great questions from all these groups. And this one is, can teachers use something in the classroom? Can educators use something in the classroom?
I've been a school psychologist for a number of years, and one of the biggest issues that I find teachers get themselves into a corner about is they'll talk about ADHD in specific terms. They'll use that term, and it puts the school at a liability position. Because if we're identifying something, we don't have the credentials to do so, then the school districts becomes liable for treating that. And so I always encourage teachers and my fellow administrators, don't ever use the term ADHD. Use terms like doesn't seem to focus well, seems to be very distractible. You can always say those things because you're a professional clinician in the arena of teaching. And so you can always make narrative comments about the behavior. But my recommendation is never use the term an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder. You can say things like this appears tired, appears a little grumpy, appears a little sullen or a little cranky or a little distractible. Stay away from the clinical term because it will put you in a bit of a diagnostic box and a liability factor when it comes to providing service.
Gotcha. I will just chime in here that we have an assessment that schools can use it, not for in the classroom, but a survey based on the CEPI, which you mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
which we use to help support schools. So, um,
Now, let me also say there are a lot of good surveys that are non-standardized and don't have that formula of reducing it down to a diagnostic level. But they have a good
okay,
surveys that are much more grassroots level and much more in the domain. So I'm not discouraging teachers from thinking about ADD. Keep that behind the curtain of professionalism, but use all of the understanding you bring to the table, but don't jump into the pool where you start using the terms as a diagnostic criteria.
gotcha, gotcha. Um, this one's a little general, so we're going to skip over it for now. And I apologize if you are on this call. If you want to put a little more detail in the chat about what you're curious about, um, as far as living with ADHD as an adult. How can I customize instructions for those with working memory issues? Um, it looks like they've used things like chunking and writing keywords, but they still feel that something is missing. Can you speak to that?
One of the big pieces, I was just talking to another parent today about this, that typically ADHD folks have a combination of a visual processing and auditory processing disorder. Some have more strengths in one area than the other, but typically most ADHD folks are very verbal and verbose. And so they tend to be able to explain their way. They're very good litigators. They really can explain their self out of a corner. And that's why a lot of good litigators are attention deficit disordered folks. But the realities are is that um, the instruction needs to be multimodal. For example, math is a visual task, but unfortunately, a lot of math instruction is given auditorily. Or for me, I've gotten to customizing information I get, I listen to it in a format so I could replicate it into a table or a rubric. That helps
Hmm.
me visualize the information and synthesize it in a different way. So anyone who's instructing students, try to provide them not only the auditory information, but put it into a visual table or a visual construct that they can now segregate the information you're telling them and see it in a visual representation. That's what you'll find that if they can, they'll put it in a plastic slipcover and leave it in their binder so they can continue to refer to it rather than trying to read notes and notes and notes. So multimodal and chunking would fall under that. But again, it's taking it to the next level and taking the auditory information and supporting them in what one would call organizational tables or other organizational features. But oftentimes ADHD people don't have the tenacity to do that. But once they realize the value of it, then that becomes their superpower.
That's, yeah, you had mentioned that people, ADHD people tend to organize things visually in their mind. So that is a brilliant response. I would only add use advanced organizers. If this is a teacher asking this, advanced organizers to sort of, in a visual format, to sort of set the table for what's coming next.
Let me also add, there's a program that I love, and it's on the Mac based or the non-Mac computer. It's called Inspiration, and it takes a concept in a mind map format. So folks that have most ADHD folks have a hard time developing paragraphs or a storyline because when we look at developing an outline, outlines can be a nemesis to us because how do we structure things in such a linear fashion? Because most ADD people are very nonlinear. So what happens is when this particular mind map, it has pre-designed mind maps for character analysis, for a book analysis, and it actually puts in the center of your screen the primary idea, and then it actually develops bubbles outside of that. And once you develop your bubbles, which ironically ADD people can do that easier, then you push a button and it converts the mind map into a outline.
I
And,
love that.
and from the outline, then you can move it into your paragraph. And the better your outline, the better your paragraph. And you can toggle between the bubbles and the outline as you wish. And then when you realize your outline needs more work, what do? You toggle over to the mind map, develop more bubbles or expand some bubbles you've already gotten, and then toggle it back to the outline. It's a wonderful tool.
Interesting. That's outstanding. So we are going to continue to go over. We have a few slides left, and then we'll ask. We'll go to the chat questions and open it up for open Q and A. As long as that's okay with you,
Yeah,
Jeff. Is
totally.
that okay?
Yeah.
What cultural obstacles stand in the way of getting a student diagnosed?
Um, when I was researching that question, unfortunately, socioeconomics tend to be at play at this point. And that's because oftentimes, unfortunately, insurance coverage, even the minimal of its insurance coverage, even the premier insurance coverages, don't pay for assessments. And that's really unfortunate because assessments help define and drive services. And so, in many times, because I've worked in schools of many years, schools don't like to do assessments for ADHD. So they'll refer the parents out for those issues. But then where do the parents go? Because financially, you're looking at between typically in the state of California, the average price is between $1,800 and $3,000 for an ADHD assessment. And that's a good, thorough assessment. And the people that are doing those, they should be qualified to do so, and they are paid well to do that work because you're looking at the assessment will pay benefits over multiple years. So you're looking at an investment that is over time. So you also want to look for potentially an assessor who will take payments or use other methodologies to help support you getting those. I would say socioeconomics is a real feature. I find that here in the United States, ADHD has become so readily understood that I don't find there's a lot of resistance to having the diagnosis or having the classification. If that's the resistance, there's probably more familial resistance for other features of seeking outside support. So so again, as a family therapist as well, if you're having resistance in regards to having a family embrace the diagnosis, they probably are having struggles embracing other diagnosable conditions, whether they're medical or situational or other components. That's just as idiosyncratic of that family system. And so I wouldn't say it's so much of a cultural issue versus more of a familial functioning style of operation.
Right. Okay, I have a student who is a doctor. Oh no, I have a student whose doctor whose doctor in school thinks she has attention issues. Uh, what is interesting is that she's been taking piano lessons and she is able to follow directions and play in public school recital. Would a high level of performance on the piano be possible for someone who actually has ADD?
Most definitely.
Yeah,
Again, because we have that superpower that if something lights up us neurologically, we're going to be one of the nice things about having an addictive personality style of function, which ADD has a high propensity of having, that if you can get that addiction to a pro-living behavior, then you're going to have some really powerful opportunities. So I would say, yeah, I would say that they found their magic button and just
nice.
allow them to grow.
Okay, what would you recommend for children under 5 that have not been diagnosed yet show all the symptoms in their preschool environment? And then the second and third parts of that question, would specific activities help? And what resources are there for parents of preschoolers with high likelihood of having ADHD? So, first question is, what do you recommend for children under 5 that have not yet been diagnosed but show symptoms?
I would check with your pediatrician first to see what their perception is. Secondly, typically when parents are saying this type of developing this kind of question or awareness, it's probably because it's a high activity child. I heard someone use the term the other day because I got a lot of calls last week about kids under 5, and they called it a hot brain. And this child's hot brain was relative to highly verbal, highly energized. One would think very ADHD, but it would be premature clinically to identify it at that. So I would say support the parents in regards to engineering their life so that they don't go insane while their child is growing through this phase, but don't diminish it. Recognize that this could be his personality style with or without ADD. If it is his personality style, then let's be aware of it. Let's make sure he's in a program, a school program, preschool that is very much endorses exploring minds. Montessori schools are very well adapted to children that have busy minds. There's other curriculums out there that are very valuable for these kinds of brains. I tested a youngster that was about 5, and the parent was very insistent, explained the pros and cons. We did the testing, and ironically, the mom realized that She was trying to push the child in an academic venue, and I encouraged them to go to cooking classes and involve the child in measuring and cooking with her in the kitchen. And obviously, that's a bit of a nightmare when you have a busy 5-year-old, but engaging them in real life activities that they can start making the connections and realizing that their behaviors have productive outcomes. So it's definitely a
Great.
challenge. I know my mom said that I was that way when I was 5. And fortunately, we lived in a family business, so I always had something to keep me busy. And so a challenge, no doubt.
Great. Um, so we're going to jump over to the chat questions. So thanks everyone for staying late with us.
Thank you.
But so the ADHD for preschool kids, any resources or something you can direct parents to check out, since you seem to have a bag of tricks for all ages?
There was one program, and I don't have it at my fingertips, but it was like it was a musical based program for preschool parents and kids to go to. It was like a structured playtime, but it had to do with musical sound devices, drums, clinking devices. It was probably maddening to be in the room, but it was very entertaining because it engaged parents with their kids, with other kids making music. And I don't recall the name of the program, but I'll send it to you, Kevin, and then you can disperse that. Um, Anything that is a hands-on, experiential based that produces pro-social, pro-interactive opportunities that's in a structured environment, so there's not chaos, is always the best place to grow early minds.
Got it. Okay, here's one that was asked very early on, and I hope that you're still on this call. I'm currently in law school, did exceptionally well as an undergrad, but given the rigors of law school, I've started to notice that I have been experiencing potential symptoms of ADHD, ADD. Is it possible that ADHD, ADD can emerge in such an environment? In other words, is law school sort of provoking this? Um, this person has had multiple cognitive type assessments before the age of 12, and there was no evidence of ADD, ADHD.
Um, I would say that yes, it's possible for someone to demonstrate that ADHD quality. I say that in parentheses, that those attributes of ADHD. My hunch is with some good tools. I use some tools, the Diva that I talked about, and then if the parents are still alive, I've got a real good retro parent questionnaire that I use to harvest information. And if you're getting ready to take the bar exam, those are valuable features. I ask for parents to provide me, and even the candidate, provide me as many report cards that they can provide, because it's interesting. Teachers are wonderful about narrating and giving firsthand testimony about how Johnny did in school. And I'll take those verbatim out of the report cards and put them in a chronological timeline to help support the testimony of what the assessment's trying to provide the reviewers to provide accommodations. So to answer your question, there's ways to harvest information that, and again, I like that you have these cognitive tests to rely on, but oftentimes it's the devil's in the details. I have to somewhat forensically pull apart those cognitive tests to look at the subtests to see really what subtest that was really pulling on in that cognitive arena to actually determine if truly there could have been activities going on in those subtests that were masked by the overall standard score that those subtests bled into. So it's really a matter of almost pulling apart the details and being able to justify why they weren't looked at specifically. But it's really more of a forensic analysis of all those tests. And if you have those, for anyone, any good evaluator you use, they should be looking at those with very very stringent detail in how to interpret what wasn't interpreted before.
Gotcha. Could you please elaborate on best practices for students who are applying for accommodations? Specifically, to what extent would a student's psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist need to outline the necessity of accommodations? Is it primarily neuropsychiatric testing focused, or is there still a significant degree of clinical observation or observation from a licensed professional?
What I always do for every candidate that comes to me is I ask them to provide me the candidate handbook, whether it's for the SAT or the GMAT, or for that particular law school bar exam, regardless of the state it's in. I always ask them to provide me that because everyone is very different, but they're very specific. They're very clear about saying simply because you're on medication doesn't mean you have ADD. Simply because you report that you have difficulties doesn't mean you have ADD. What they're looking for is historical data, whether it's accommodations that were provided with you in high school or middle school or elementary school. It's more of that retroactive harvesting of information to help provide evidence that things were going on. If someone's profile is impacting their ability to function professionally or advance to that professional degree, my hunch is that you probably have the propensity for ADHD, and it's a matter of really teasing out all those variables early in your life so that we can, again, match that prior to 12-year-old requirement as we talked about earlier in the workshop.
And I can speak to this a little bit. So one of the questions is, to what extent would a student's medical professional need to outline the necessity of accommodations? Is it primarily neuropsychiatric testing, or is there still a degree of clinical observation? And I would say, and you can correct me, Jeff, if I'm wrong, but essentially it's both, right? There's like cognitive testing or neuropsych testing, and there's usually an observational component. And although the medical practitioner could be a psychologist, could be a psychiatrist, could be a licensed social worker, that those pieces have to be consistent. And as you said, they also have to be consistent throughout, like consistently used. So when people are applying to college and through us and, applying for SAT or ACT accommodations, if they've had a diagnosis, when they were 12, but then they didn't use any of the accommodations that the diagnosis supported, it's more difficult to get the College Board or ACT or whomever, GMAT, to allow the accommodation. But anyways, the short answer is, my experience is it's a combination of both observational and neuropsych. Is that pretty standard?
Yeah, and they'll say it in a variety of ways, but the bottom line is that they're looking for not just the medical diagnosis, but they're looking for the integration of the condition and evidence across multiple domains. And that's why
Right.
you see those tools that I used that are very respected in the field. So no one can question the tools that I use because they're standing on solid psychometric parameters. So yeah, it's that definitely you want all of those features, but it has to be really wrapped in the language that the governing board is wanting to quantify their records for.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. So this one's going to be a general one. If a student has been on ADHD medication since age 10 and has no appetite, lost about 20 pounds, went on I guess the stimulant version of medication, would you suggest they continue or discontinue the meds? I don't that one might be tough to answer without, a medical diagnosis or, more information. But it's the crux of the question seems to be the medication they're on is a stimulant based medication, and it looks like it's causing them to lose weight, and they have no appetite. So it's suppressing their appetite. You have an opinion on that?
The opinion that I would have to assert first is that I'm not a medical doctor. So just to cover the bases, that's out of my practice in regards to the medical features. I would say that if you've got solid data to support that he's got ADHD, and if you have a really profound prescriber, they should take those variables into account and recognize that maybe we need to shift the medication to a different formula, a different cocktail. I know when I first started, I was on a variety of anti-anxiety medication, antidepressant medication, and a small dose of stimulant. And that worked well for a while, but then I removed the anti-anxiety because that became controlled because my lifestyle became improved. And so it's really a cocktail kind of idea. And you want to find a prescriber that understands that nuance. I know that here in California, the Amen Clinic, Dr. Amen has been doing this work for a number of years. I can really attest to his work, but he's got lots of other folks that fall into the same philosophical understanding that the neurochemistry is complicated, and you need to have someone that really understands
Yeah.
those features to know how to mix the medications to provide the optimum outcome. And they will change. And one of the documents that I'll send you, Kevin, is that lifespan of ADHD. And it does talk about at every developmental stage that neurology shifts and expectations of life change. And because ADDers tend to be about 7 years behind the developmental curve, you've got a variety of active variables that always have to be monitored to know that we're maximizing the treatment.
Yeah, and I would just underscore the neurochemistry is so complex that you absolutely want to sort of go back to the medical professional on that because there are too many variables, right? For us to say, oh, well, the person's losing weight, get them off. Like we don't have that level
Right.
of knowledge and understanding.
I
So
have seen, let me add just to that. I've seen that folks that tend to have that propensity to lose weight, they do report a higher degree of anxiety. And typically, if, and again, I'm not speaking as a medical doctor, but sometimes it's those stimulants that are driving the more anxiety-based features, and they need to be toned down a bit. And my psychiatrist used to say, let's bring down your stimulant and increase your antidepressant, not by virtue because of the titles, but because of what they do neurologically.
to your
And
brain.
it reduces that anxiety feature, which potentially would be parallel to why they're not eating, is because they have more anxiety spikes than they're reporting.
Gotcha. So, folks, if you have questions that we did not answer, but you still have them, you're welcome to unmute your microphone. And while you do that, I'll put a plug in for us. We are Learnfully. We are an assessment company. We do professional development, especially executive function simulations for schools. We offer IEP, SLP, and 504 support plans for schools and parents. We also have a great team of educational coaches that work on study skills and positive habit building, reading and math, catch up, and coaching for grades 8, K through 8, and ADHD coaching for grades 9 through adult. So, and I joined the company recently within the last year to help neurodivergent students with their college readiness. So, would love to talk more to any one of you about any of those things. And if you need to get in touch about this presentation or anything, here's the way to get in touch with us. We will be sending a link to the video in a day or so, so you'll be able to get this. We'll definitely cut out the part where we had trouble with the screen share. We'll edit it. Um, but we'll send out the rest of the information to you all. So, any other questions? Does anyone want to open up their mic and ask questions?